When people talk about unsafe childhoods, they usually picture something obvious: violence, addiction, visible neglect, a parent who was clearly absent or clearly harmful or clearly not capable of providing what a child needed. What is much harder to see and much more common than most people realize is the home that looked completely fine, where the parents were present and trying, where the basic needs were met and the house was clean and the birthdays were marked, where by any external standard the childhood was adequate, but where something very specific was missing, where feelings weren't safe, not because anyone said so directly. No one announced, "Your emotions are not welcome here." But there were rules, unwritten, unspoken, absolutely enforced, about which feelings were acceptable and which weren't, about which versions of you were tolerated and which created a problem, about what happened when you were too much, or too sad, or too angry, or too afraid. A child raised in that environment doesn't learn that their home was emotionally unsafe. They learn something far more personal, that their emotions are the problem, that they are the problem, that the appropriate response to their own inner experience is to manage it, minimize it, perform around it before it lands on anyone else. Today we're looking at 10 signs that you grew up in an emotionally unsafe home without realizing it. Not to assign blame, not to catastrophize a childhood that had real good things in it alongside the difficult ones, but because you cannot tend to a wound you cannot see. And a lot of people are tending to symptoms in their relationships, in their self-esteem, in the way they navigate their own emotions. Without understanding where those symptoms came from, this might be where they came from. Emotional safety in a home is not the absence of difficulty, conflict, frustration, sadness, fear. These are normal parts of life, and a child doesn't need to be protected from all of them. What a child needs is to know that when those feelings arrive, they will be met with something: curiosity, acknowledgement, presence, care. An emotionally unsafe home is one where that response is consistently absent or punishing, where the child's emotional experience, not just the extreme ones, but the ordinary ones, the everyday ones, is regularly met with dismissal, anger, withdrawal, or the message that having the feeling is the problem. This can look like many different things. It can look like a parent who becomes angry when a child cries. It can look like a parent who shuts down and withdraws when the emotional temperature rises. It can look like the family that never talks about anything difficult, where "we're fine" is the answer to every question. It can look like the home where one parent's emotional state dominates everything, and everyone else's job is to manage around it. What it produces in the child who grows up inside it is very specific: a person who learned to navigate their emotional world without support, who learned that feelings are problems, who learned that the way to stay safe with the people they depended on for everything was to manage their inner experience before it reached the outside world. Let's look at what that learning looks like in practice. Sign 1. You learn to manage your parents' emotions before your own. Before you knew what you were doing it. Reading the temperature of the room when a parent came home, adjusting your behavior based on what kind of day they'd had, knowing when to be quiet, when to be cheerful, when to disappear. This is called parentification of the emotional register, the process by which a child takes on the emotional management work that belongs to the adult. It happens not because the child is asked to, and not because they are unusually mature. It happens because in an environment where the adult's emotional state is volatile, unpredictable, or dominant, the child's nervous system learns very quickly that monitoring and managing it is essential for safety. The child who learns to manage their parents' emotions before their own grows into an adult who does the same thing with everyone around them, who knows before a word is spoken how the person across from them is doing, who adjusts and accommodates and makes themselves smaller or larger depending on what is needed, who has become so skilled at reading and managing others that they have almost no practice reading and managing themselves. The skill is real, it is sometimes impressive. What it costs to develop it, the years of self-erasure, the systematic suppression of one's own inner life in favor of managing another's, is what takes a long time to see. Sign 2. Certain feelings were treated as problems to be solved, rather than experiences to be acknowledged. You were sad, and someone immediately tried to give you a reason not to be. You were angry, and the anger was treated as a behavior problem rather than as information about what you were experiencing. You were afraid, and the fear was either dismissed, there's nothing to be scared of, or fixed. Here, have this, but never simply sat with. In an emotionally healthy environment, a child's feelings are met with presence first. I see that you're sad. I understand that you're angry. I can see this is scary for you. The acknowledgement comes before the problem solving. The child learns that their emotional experience is real and valid, regardless of whether the external situation warrants it by adult standards. In an emotionally unsafe home, feelings are treated as problems. The sadness is a problem to fix. The anger is a problem to stop. The fear is a problem to resolve. The speed of the pivot to solution, away from the feeling and toward the fix, communicates something very specific to the child. Your feelings are inconvenient, and the appropriate response to having them is to make them stop as quickly as possible. The adult who grew up in this environment often has the same relationship to their own feelings that their caregiver had. They experience an emotion and immediately move to fix it, dismiss it, or explain it away. They are impatient with their own inner life. They have learned to treat their feelings as problems because that is what they watched feelings be treated as for the first 20 years of their life. Sign 3. Conflict was either explosive or completely avoided, but never worked through. Conflict in the home was never simply a disagreement that was navigated, addressed, and resolved. It was either something that erupted, sudden, intense, sometimes frightening, or something that was completely avoided, buried under a layer of performed normalcy that everyone knew was performed but no one acknowledged. Neither mode teaches a child anything useful about how to work through conflict. The explosive version teaches that conflict is dangerous, that emotions, when they reach a certain level, become uncontrollable and cause damage. The avoidant version teaches that conflict cannot be addressed directly, that the right response to difficulty in a relationship is to pretend it isn't there until it either dissolves or erupts. What neither version provides is the experience of conflict worked through, of two people disagreeing, naming the disagreement, staying present with the discomfort, and arriving at something better, or at least at a better understanding, on the other side. The adult who grew up without this model either escalates quickly when conflict arises, because that was the only way feelings got expressed, or avoids it entirely, because the explosion model made conflict feel too dangerous. And in both cases, the relationships they build reflect a person who never learned what healthy conflict resolution actually looks like because they never saw it. Sign 4. You learned to read the room before entering it. You knew before you opened the door, before you came down the stairs, before you walked into the kitchen in the morning. You knew whether it was going to be a good day or a difficult one. You could tell from the quality of the silence, the sound of footsteps, the specific quality of the air in the house. This is not intuition. This is hypervigilance, a very specific form of threat detection that develops in environments where the emotional atmosphere is unpredictable and where getting it wrong has consequences. The child who learned to read the room before entering it did not develop this skill because they were unusually perceptive. They developed it because their environment required it, because the cost of misreading it, of walking into a bad moment unprepared, of asking for something at the wrong time, of being cheerful when the room required quiet, was real enough that their nervous system learned to do the work of assessment before exposure. That skill, honed across years of childhood, does not disappear when the child grows up and leaves. It travels with them into every room they enter for the rest of their life, into every relationship, every professional environment, every social situation. The person who does this in adulthood is not paranoid or oversensitive. They are running a threat detection program that made complete sense in the environment that built it. Sign 5. Vulnerability was punished, directly or indirectly. You showed something real, fear, sadness, confusion, the honest version of how you were doing. And what came back was not what vulnerability is supposed to produce. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was dismissal, the impatient "you're fine" or "there's nothing to cry about" that ended the conversation before it began. Maybe it was the parent who turned their child's vulnerability into a burden, making the child feel guilty for having needs or for having feelings that required attention. Maybe it was more subtle than that, the slight withdrawal, the change in tone, the specific quality of not quite being there that told the child without words that this was unwelcome. When vulnerability is consistently punished or dismissed, the child learns the obvious lesson. Showing what you actually feel is not safe, and so they stop. Not all at once. Gradually. The range of what gets expressed narrows. The honest version gets managed before it reaches the surface. The child who used to cry freely learns to hold it. The child who asks questions learns to figure it out alone. The adult who learned this in childhood often has a very difficult relationship with their own vulnerability in adult life. They admire it in others. They cannot produce it easily themselves. When they try, they feel exposed in a way that is disproportionate because the nervous system that learned early that vulnerability was dangerous has not yet received enough evidence that in this environment it isn't. Sign 6. You apologized constantly for things that were not your fault. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Not in response to genuine wrongdoing, but as a reflex, as the thing that came out of your mouth when the emotional temperature rose, when someone was upset, when there was tension, regardless of whether you had done anything to cause it. This is what the psychologist Harriet Lerner calls the knee-jerk apology. The automatic sorry that is less about taking responsibility for something specific and more about managing the emotional environment, about lowering the temperature, about taking up less space, about signaling, "I am not a threat, I am not a problem, please don't be angry with or around me." Children who grow up in emotionally unsafe homes often learn this strategy because it works. When a parent is upset and the child apologizes, sometimes the upset diminishes. The apology functions as a de-escalation tool, a way of managing the parent's emotional state by removing the self as a source of irritation. What this produces in adulthood is a person who apologizes for their presence, who says sorry when someone walks into them, who takes responsibility for other people's bad days, who experiences the normal frustrations and disappointments of other people as somehow caused by them, requiring their apology and repair. The chronic apologizer did not learn to take responsibility. They learned that they were responsible for the emotional comfort of everyone around them, and the apology became the tool of that impossible assignment. Sign 7. You felt responsible for keeping the peace. When the tension rose between your parents, or when a parent's mood darkened, or when the family was approaching one of its difficult moments, somehow you were there, doing something, saying something that diffused it, changing the subject, being funny, being helpful, being visible in a way that pulled the attention away from whatever was about to happen. You became the family's emotional regulator, not because you were asked to, but because you saw that it worked, that your cheerfulness could interrupt a bad trajectory, that your helpfulness could redirect your parents' energy, that making yourself useful or entertaining or easy could buy the household a few more hours of calm. This is a role that many children in emotionally unsafe homes take on, and it is a role that comes with enormous cost. The child who keeps the peace does not get to have their own inner life during those moments, their own feelings, their own needs, their own experience of the family. All of it is subordinated to the project of managing the family's emotional climate. The adult who carried this role has often become extraordinarily good at it. They're the person their friends call when things are hard, the one who mediates, the one who knows how to be in a difficult room and make it slightly better. What they have much less practice with is the inverse, being in a room where they are the difficult thing, where their needs are the thing being centered, where someone else is doing the work of making the space safe for them. Sign 8. The story of your family was always fine, and you learned to tell it that way. When someone asked how your family was, the answer was always some version of fine, good, normal. We're a close family. My parents love me, all of which might have been true, and none of which captured what it was actually like to be inside it. One of the specific features of emotionally unsafe homes is that they often look very normal from the outside, and people who grew up in them often become very skilled at presenting that normal exterior, because they learned early that the interior version of the story was not one that would be understood, believed, or helpful to share. The message can come directly. We don't talk about family things outside the family. It can come indirectly. The parent who visibly becomes uncomfortable when the child says something real about what home is like. It can come from the child's own assessment, the recognition that what they're describing doesn't match the template of what a bad childhood is supposed to look like, and therefore cannot be credibly named as a problem. And so the story gets told the way the story is supposed to be told. And the child, and later the adult, lives with the gap between the story and the experience, a gap that can be very lonely to carry. Sign 9. You became very good at not needing things. At some point, not all at once, but gradually, you stopped asking for things. Not the big things necessarily, but the ordinary things. Comfort when you were upset, attention when something went wrong, the presence of someone who was interested in how you were doing and had the capacity to respond to the answer. You stopped asking because asking cost something. Maybe the ask was met with impatience, the parent who was too depleted or too preoccupied to respond in a way that helped. Maybe it was met with guilt, the parent who made the child feel like having needs was an imposition. Maybe it simply wasn't met consistently enough that the child's nervous system learned the ask produces nothing useful, and the cost of the ask, the hope, the vulnerability, the specific disappointment of not receiving, is greater than the cost of not asking. And so you became very good at not needing, at figuring things out yourself, at managing your own emotional experience without input from anyone else, at being the kind of child, and later the kind of person who never seemed to require much. This looks like independence. It is often praised. What it actually is, in many cases, is the specific suppression of legitimate needs in an environment that could not reliably meet them. And the adult who learned it carries a very particular kind of loneliness. The loneliness of never asking for what they need in environments that might actually be able to provide it. Sign 10. You still feel guilty for naming any of this. This might be the most specific sign of all. As you read this list or watch this video, some part of you is uncomfortable, not just because it is naming something difficult, but because naming it feels like a betrayal, like you are doing something disloyal to people you love, like you are making them into villains, for something that probably wasn't intentional. Like you are being dramatic or self-indulgent or making too much of things that plenty of people had worse. This guilt, the guilt of naming what your home was actually like, is one of the most characteristic features of growing up in an emotionally unsafe environment. Because one of the unwritten rules in those homes is that the family is fine, that the story is a good one, that problems are private and loyalty is demonstrated by silence. And so naming becomes a violation. It feels like betrayal. It produces the specific discomfort of doing something you have spent your whole life learning not to do, saying honestly, out loud, what the inside of your experience was like. You are allowed to name it, not to destroy the people who created the environment. Most of them were doing the best they could with what they had, but because you cannot tend to what you cannot see, because the loyalty that keeps you silent does not serve you, and because the truth of what your home was like, acknowledged clearly and without drama, is the beginning of no longer having to carry it alone. 10 signs. None of them require an abusive parent. None of them require a dramatic story. All of them are the specific products of an environment where feelings were not fully safe, where the unwritten rules about which emotions were acceptable shaped the child in ways the child did not have the language to name. An emotionally unsafe home does not require a villain. Most parents who created these environments were doing the best they could with what they had, which was often the same set of tools their own parents used. The absence of emotional safety was usually not intentional. It was the repetition of a pattern that no one had yet found the language to interrupt. You're not betraying your parents by naming what was missing. You're not being dramatic. You're not making too much of something that other people had worse. You're doing the specific, difficult, necessary work of seeing clearly what your environment was, so that you can understand clearly what you learned in it and begin slowly to decide which of those lessons you want to keep. Because some of what you learned in that environment served you, and some of it didn't, and you are allowed to know the difference. If this video named something, share it with someone who might recognize themselves in it. Sometimes the most useful thing is simply the language for something you've been navigating your whole life without a name for it. Take care of yourself. We'll see you in the next one.